Welcome to Code Savvy Presents, a podcast about computer science, technology, accessibility, and inclusion.
We are so thrilled and honored to welcome our guest speakers as a part of our AI and bias panel. I'm just going to give a very quick intro, and then I'm going to pass it over to our panelists to tell us just a little bit more about themselves and maybe share their favorite subject in school from when they were kids. It's always fun to learn a little bit of background about about what passions our panelists have had. And so I'll just give a quick intro and shout out to each of our panelists here, and then I'll pass it over to them to give introductions. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Ellena Schoop. Ellena is a Senior Data Governance Planner at the state of Minnesota in the IT department. Ellena also has done really some awesome work with Code Savvy. She's a part of our board and has been a volunteer with Technovation Minnesota. So we're so glad Ellena could be here. Thanks again, Ellena. We've got Dan McCreary joining us as well. Dan is a distinguished engineer in AI and graph at Optum. And Dan has also been a really crucial part of Code Savvy for a long time volunteer through Coder Dojo TC. If you've ever gone to Coder Dojo, you've probably seen and interacted with Dan. And Dan is also kind of the founder of the AI Racing League and some of the great work happening around AI and teaching kids about AI in the Twin Cities. So thanks, Dan, for being here. We're also super thrilled to be here today with Eri O'Diah. Thanks so much, Eri, for joining us. Eri is founder and chief visionary officer at SIID Technologies, and Eri has also been involved with Code Savvy through supporting Technovation Minnesota and their work. So thank you again, panelists, everyone, for being here. And Ellena, maybe I'll pass it over to you to start off if you want to introduce yourself a little bit further and maybe tell us about your favorite subject when you were a kid or favorite subject in school.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that intro, Andrea. And my name is Ellena Schoop.
Thanks, Ellena. Sorry.
That's okay. And yes, I work for the state of Minnesota. My favorite subject in school, I think it depends on, when in elementary school, I think it was elementary and high was English and writing, because I am also an artist. So I like to write plays. And so that I was just fascinated with the English language. So that was my favorite subject in school.
Thanks, Ellena. We're so glad you're here. Ellena Schoop. I'm going to say it a couple times so I get it right.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Appreciate
just remember it. Telescope.
Telescope. Love it. Love it. Love it. Thanks, Ellena. So glad you're here. How about Dan? You want to go next?
Sure. My favorite subject in school was geometry. I'm a dyslexic. So anything dealing with words and numbers that got misplaced, I didn't do well, but visualizing the way things fit together was very easy. And that has really helped me very much in my career, visualizing the way data moves through computer systems. So I always reach out to kids, especially in Coder Dojo, that have neurodiversity and all the different ways that people learn, and try to find materials that help tie to the things that they really are interested in.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that, Dan. Yeah, so helpful to be able to draw on some of those personal experiences, personal learning preferences when connecting with students. Thanks, Dan. Let's pass it over to Eri. How about you, Eri? Welcome. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me. Favorite subject, I would say history and art were my favorite. My sweet spot is creative strategy as an adult now as a career. So art and just, history. I've always been fascinated by different cultures and history as well. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Eri, I'd love to start this next question with you, if that's okay. Would you be able to tell us just a little bit about how you got involved in kind of the AI space and what your current role, how it's connected to AI?
Oh, wow. Okay. it's a long-winded story, but my background is in entertainment, marketing specifically, from an entertainment perspective. And so as far as AI, AI has been part of my work with digital marketing, with marketing automation tools. In 2018, I had the opportunity through my agency, to work on the Super Bowl, and had an opportunity to go to SportsCom at Optum back in 2018. And that experience exposed me to the real world, real life today capabilities of AI. At that time, Kaepernick had taken a knee. There was a rise in Trumpism, and Black Lives Matter. There's a rise in Black Lives Matter protest as well. So, going into 2019 and things were just getting worse, I started to really dive into, how AI is being used. And one of the case studies that I really delved into was the use of AI with Grammarly, and how Grammarly had used AI to teach users how to become better writers. And I was like, wouldn't it be fascinating? Wouldn't it be great if we can use AI to identify our own biases, so that as we build marketing campaigns, as we communicate with each other, we're more mindful and more culturally sensitive to what we're pushing out, right? Because it's unconscious and we don't know, we all have it, right? As a woman of color, I'm not immune to bias. And having worked in the marketing space, having been relegated to confirming stereotypes as that token Black person, I just felt like the technology exists. The application is where SIID Technology differentiates itself from everyone else, right? How we're actually applying AI. So the tech is not new; it's application that it's different.
That's fascinating work. Oh my gosh, yes, that's amazing. That's amazing. What an important and incredibly innovative idea to draw kind of that inspiration from Grammarly. And I think the work you're doing is so groundbreaking. I really appreciate that. Thanks, Eri. Dan, let's pass it over to you. How about you? How did you kind of get started in the AI space, or what got you interested in it? And what are some of the ways you're connected now?
Well, I have been interested in AI ever since high school in the late 70s, show my age here a little bit, when I started to see some of the movies that depicted the future. And I think there are two movies that impacted me. One was Colossus, the movie that had the Russian and US computers get connected together, and they automatically started to talk to each other. And I've always been asking myself, how do we get computers to do that in reality? So a lot of the patents that I've filed really have to do with computer-to-computer communications. I think the thing that really got me moving towards AI in education was just starting to see the entire economic impact that it's going to have on our society. And the whole idea of most truck drivers having their jobs be replaced by autonomous vehicles. So many of the things that we do in our lives are going to be changed. Alexa is a really good example of that. And there's two dimensions. One is, how do we teach AI in the classroom? But also, how do we help teachers use AI to create better curriculum and to make sure that that curriculum is not full of bias and things. And one of the first things I did when the large language models came out last year was start to build tools so that teachers can give a high-level description of a curriculum, and it can generate lesson plans and curriculum ideas, as well as even the boring detail stuff like how do you generate multiple choice quizzes. And a lot of the work that Grammarly has done. I'm a huge fan of Grammarly, by the way. It has taught me to be a much better writer. how do we integrate that so that teachers can have this huge leverage where they can just give high-level ideas and then guide AI bots to generate the exact curriculum that's context sensitive to their students and also much more tightly tied to their educational objectives, whether that's teaching bias, teaching ecology, whatever their curriculum is striving for. We want to make sure we can generate curriculum and the resources for that curriculum without the teachers having to spend so much time. So I've been really focused on helping teachers learn about AI, but also use AI to build better lesson plans.
Okay. That sounds amazing. Either in the chat or with the little Zoom hand, teachers on the call, raise your hand if you would be interested in using AI to help you generate lesson plans or to help you think of what you might cover next. Definitely me. Yep, for sure.
I just put a little link in there. I blog frequently about using large language models to generate STEM lesson plans. So please go ahead and read that and let me know if I can help you. And I'm always looking for people to beta test these things too. So
I can already say you can help us right now. I'll tell you that much right now, because we're our civic use case, we're leveraging AI to evaluate body cam footage and then use that to develop targeted forms of training for police officers. So I would love to speak with you, Dan. Absolutely.
That's awesome. I love that so much. Very cool. Now, Ellena, you've been involved a lot with data, and I'm curious to know kind of your connections there from data to AI and kind of your vision for kind of the ways that your work intertwines with AI.
Sure. So I got involved, I think, because I do work at the state. I got involved when I have a family member who has a disability and having to kind of navigate some of the systems, especially, for example, at Regent's Hospital, they weren't accounting for a lot of the things that you would think the AI would account for. So that's kind of the first introduction to AI for me. And then as I got involved, because I'm also kind of founder and co-chair of 2 statewide employee resources groups at the state. One is for the Equity and Justice Black Caucus. The other one is for women IT change makers. And I noticed when you're looking at, for example, kind of HR applications, there's a lot of that stuff has AI behind it. And so I couldn't collect the data, but I started asking questions around, are they really looking for bias? Are they considering bias? Because one of the things that I noticed is that that people work with what is. So if it's a lot of men that apply for jobs, then of course, those are the ones that rise to the top in that pool, as opposed to looking at what it should be. So I've been working kind of with different groups about how you kind of, how you consider your AI bias as you're developing, because I also work with developers and architects. And so if you're writing code, that's something that you should be thinking about in what you're writing, especially with some of the major systems at the state, and what is the algorithm that they're using, and making sure that they're including in part of their testing bias, or if there is bias. So that's kind of been mine, and the vision is for me is, as they're developing using AI, that testing for bias, to start doing that kind of testing, and then B, do it to the point where you at some point no longer have to do it, because a lot of the data sets and algorithms, especially me dealing with data, is focused a lot on the number of records. So if you're always in the minority, it's not accounted for. If you are in a particular zip code, it's not accounted. So how do you address that in your code, in your testing? So and hopefully we don't have to do that one day, but I'll probably be long gone and retired by then. But that is my hope. I really appreciate that people are starting to talk about it in the school, but there's a whole generation of people that don't even think about it, that are already in the workforce. So my goal is to work with the folks in the workforce to kind of help them understand that and educate them in that area. So yeah, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I really appreciate that, Ellena. I'm thinking especially about, the examples you shared about kind of in the hospital and how AI is used, and it doesn't really capture necessarily the whole picture that needs to be captured. And then in some of the in the HR practices and in reviewing applications and things like that, I wondered if you had to call out kind of a positive example of AI and a negative example of AI, would you have any others that you would want to shed light on, thinking about hey, this is one really, really helpful way that AI has changed the way that we do work, and this is maybe a negative thing or a negative consequence that's come out of it.
Sure. So I'll start with the negative. Of course, there's a whole lot of negative examples. Were you asking me, or I'm sorry?
Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll skip to Eri next.
Okay. So for me, one of the negative examples among others is one of the projects that I kind of learned a lot about is mapping for prejudice, where a lot of the things was based on zip code. I'm also seeing, as they're doing development and trying to do development, basing things on zip code by itself can actually introduce also bias. So if you're trying to improve a neighborhood, say in North Minneapolis, and you're looking at the property value, you're looking at what is, not what you want it to be. So then what question do you really need to be asking yourself around what should it be? So that is a kind of a negative. The good thing about that is that it has been called out. I think that there's some programs now where they look at it differently. So it's a negative in the sense that it was being done by zip code. The positive is people are aware that they need to make sure that you're not using zip code and where a person lives inappropriately, because of course that was very inappropriately done. So to me, that's the positive, because there is more awareness around, we talk generally about bias and race, ethnicity, and so forth, but we don't talk much about zip code or even, your education level. Yeah. So I think that one is both a negative and a positive.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing about that. I see Eri added in the chat about digital redlining. Eri, let's pass it over to you. I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking.
Yeah, sure. I think in the medical space, using AI to help doctors better diagnose and recommend care. I think that's a positive, having that technology. At the same time, the negative is there's a gap in data, right? And there isn't enough representation in the data that's being used to make those recommendations, to that predictive modeling that's being used. So it doesn't represent women of color and other people of color, right? So when you look at the death rates at Black women while giving birth and the babies themselves, you see that bias manifest itself there as well.
Yeah, that's so important to call attention to. And yeah, maybe a follow-up question is, and we'll pass to Dan as well, but I'm just curious, what's the best way to go about identifying where some of those gaps and biases exist? And does it come down to, individuals who are just really looking at the data and looking at the systems to say like, hey, there's, this isn't telling the whole story, or this is really excluding specific populations?
Well, it's from my understanding, and there's a lot more that I need to learn about the core problem where it resonates, but I think it's important to educate both sides. There's a systemic issues around the medical industry, starting with insurance and the lack of access for communities of color to gain insurance and to be able to get those checkups, and the opportunity where physicians would be collecting those insights that the AI would then use to make recommendations. Those biometrics are not available to that community. So, and then at the same time, the community needs to be educated on the importance of biometrics, right? And what that actually means. And, we have this I don't know, movie perception of AI and the Terminator and all of that. So it's like when people think of biometrics and AI, that's what they think of, right? So I think the public needs to be educated, and that's where we're moving as a society. So we need to kind of get with the times a little bit and understand the importance of aggregating this information from the public community side and from the medical engineering side as well.
Yeah, that is so important, and makes me think too about some of the work, Dan, that you've been doing related to getting kids introduced to AI. And a lot of the spaces that you've been working in also have their parents or family members nearby, and so doing a little bit of kind of some of that community education piece. I'm just curious, Dan, kind of how you see that, and especially if some of your work introducing AI with kids, if there's space to kind of talk about some of those positive and negative impacts of AI.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge a lot of discussions about the challenges of bias in healthcare, something I deal with almost every day. My department manages what's called our healthcare disparities dashboards, where for every single county in the entire United States, we do detailed analysis of the disparities based on gender, race, all the age disparities, things like that. I'll say that these disparities were there way before AI became popular, right? AI wasn't really a cause of those disparities, but AI has really helped us find those disparities and start to put in preventive measures. Maternal care is a big area, diabetes care. There's about a dozen areas that we have now teams that are actively focusing on through the Optum social responsibility. And a lot of this is volunteer work too, where people are now going out to clinics where they're seeing disparities in certain things and seeing if we can try to do proactive education. So that's my day job. So something that's really important, and I think the other speakers have really acknowledged it. To answer your question, getting back to the kids, and some of the things that what I'm really interested in is at what age can we introduce these concepts? There's so many studies that show that the earlier you introduce some concepts to kids, the better they integrate it into everything they do, right? And this is not just coding, and this is not just our data science, but a lot of everything we do touches these days. Marketing, chemistry, sales, physics, everything is dealing with data. And what we really see is that when Optum and United Health Groups tries to hire people, very often they don't have the basics of data science. And data science is the fundamental way that we detect bias and correct for bias. Right? In the past, we did not have an AI review board that would review our machine learning generated models. But we have gotten definite feedback from our stakeholders that they want to make sure that we are not only detecting, but we're correcting first. Now, and this goes back to history, right? The fact that we have huge amount of bias in geospatial distributions, zip codes, right? We have often used zip code as a way to predict what services are best fit for our customers. But those also tend to be very biased because of the populations within those. So the good news is that that this whole movement has started to help us be aware of those biases. And the good news is we can test for those biases in many different dimensions: gender, race, ethnicity, ageism, accessism. All the disabilities are now starting to come to the front of the queue, as we want to be able to test for those biases too. Obesity is another bias that we also have, we have reports that show that when people are more obese, we're also not treating them as well as we could in other areas. So every time we see a way to divide our population, we can test for that. And once we start to test for that, we can start to correct for it. The one thing about machine assisted, I always use the word machine assisted, because 99.9% of the time, we're always having a doctor in the loop, right? We're not saying you must do this as a machine. We don't have any chatbots that say you have to take this drug. It's always cognitive agents for our physicians, for our nurses, for our call center people to help suggest care paths that are appropriate. So when do we start to teach that for our kids? That's a hard question, but I think what we're trying to do is, and some of the material you've shown is the drawing program. Isn't that a fun way? And then not only do the kids experience trying to play it, but we can show them the data set. One of the funny things we do is we can start to ask people about cars. Do you notice that there's cars, but there's also trucks, there's also fire trucks, there's also pickup trucks? Well, who decides what objects should be there? How do we define that taxonomy? And that shows our bias also. The types of objects. Why is it that we have a lot of vehicles, but not a lot of different variation of plant types or insect types, right? So all of the data sets that are created by humans are inherently biased. And what we need to do is teach our students, even at as young as I think as the 5th grade, that whenever you have a data set created by humans, there's a chance for bias. And we can analyze it and we can use data science to do that. I'll tell you my big long-term goal here is the fundamental problems of our society I see are coming from the fact that we don't teach data literacy enough and early enough, right? AI is a subfield, or machine learning is specifically, as you pointed out, is a subfield of AI. AI includes all these things like coding, right? Conditional, what we call symbolic programming, where you traverse a graph of symbols, and that's very explainable. But all of these things are driven by data. And one of the things I'm trying to do is get grants for companies that are struggling to find our students that don't have enough basic background. And we have to spend a lot of their initial training period in the first year that they're out of college, especially, but also trying to figure out how we get more students involved early on. So I think we need to be very passionate about teaching the fundamentals, not just coding, but the data literacy related to that coding. And so I see a huge shift in our curriculums in the next couple of years. So we combine not just code savvy, but maybe data savvy, and put those together and have programs. And I think there's a huge amount of grants out there that I hope we can get and apply that and help teachers integrate those things into their curriculum earlier. So, all right, I've been talking too much here probably. So.
Yeah, thanks for those perspectives, Dan. I saw Ellena giving a thumbs up. Ellena, did you want to add anything to that?
Valerie, yes, too.
Yes, because data is my world. I'm really glad that you mentioned data literacy, because I bring that up a lot. you know, it is one thing to kind of do programming. It's another thing to understand data literacy. Why is it important to have governance? Why is it important to have quality data? You know, because as you start bringing these data sets together and people are making decisions based on that data, if it's bad data, then it's bad data. And then you add AI on top of that, that makes it worse. So I am so glad that you mentioned data literacy, because I think that's a fundamental piece that I think is really important. And very few, in my opinion, very few schools, even at the college level, even educate on that. It's all one big computer science thing, you know, databases and all other kind of technical stuff, but not really data literacy and why that's important. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I echo that.
Love it. That's such a great point. It makes me think too about kind of this educator training cohort that so many of us on this call are a part of, and where we might be able to layer in some of those pieces about data science and data literacy. I know we have some math teachers on the call who are probably like, yes. Eri, I was curious, you mentioned that in some of your work, you're starting to look at using AI to examine or to interpret some of the body cam footage. And I'm just curious about some of the data sets or some of the places that your work is drawing data from. Just sounds really, really fascinating.
We're I guess dabbling or navigating and exploring the space of the voice and computer imaging space as well. And that's where we're pulling that data from, speech to text transcriptions and evaluations, and really understanding behavior through those three vehicles, you know, voice, text, and image. And when the baseline algorithm that we're building would really be used in much of all of our solutions. And that's to address workforce development, to address communication similar to Grammarly in the marketing and media space. And also we're now unexpectedly exploring the civic case where we're using AI to identify bias within officer interactions and then deploy targeted training for that officer by having an understanding of that individual officer. Right, we're all different. So we have, very much like in the medical industry where there's care plans, individual care plans for everyone, there should be individual workforce development training for everyone as well.
Wow, that sounds amazing and very, very necessary. I am excited about that work, and excited to hear more as things progress for you. Thanks for sharing that. So kind of our last question that I have planned, and then I'll also invite questions from the group here from the audience or any other resources that our panelists want to share. But kind of our last question is just how youth and maybe even educators, since we're all educators in the group here, how could we get involved, or how could we help our students get involved in recognizing and combating bias in AI or in tech more broadly? Just opening it up for the panelists, whoever would like to jump in.
It's a quiet group, so I'll just jump in. I say everybody go do research, use Google, and send Andrea all your ideas so we can put them all in a good resource and test them all out. She's got a great start, and we'd love your help at finding this curriculum and then classifying it, what age group, what background, what prerequisites, and really starting to create our knowledge graph of teaching these concepts. Differentiated by age group and background and things like that.
I would say, yes, definitely use some of the tools, and how they can get involved is just like other things where like there's games. I know Google has a tool where you can actually visualize your data set. So you could see in the quadrant, for example, which data points are kind of outside of the circle or the square, and kind of have discussions around that. Why is it these 5 records up in the top left versus the other 80 down in the lower right, and just having, having conversations and finding or even creating some of those visuals, because I think, especially for kids, visuals are really, really important. Like, we can talk conceptually, but when you see it in a data set, then it's easier to kind of have a conversation about it. At least ask and ask questions. So, but I think that's one way. So
that is that's a game changer, I think, for a lot of us in education, because so many of the math lessons talk about, you can sort of drop the outliers when we're looking at data sets. And so instead of dropping outliers, we're focusing in on them as case studies, and how might we include the insights that these outliers are, speaking in data terms, I guess, are sharing with us. Like, that's really important information. So I appreciate that a lot. Eri, go ahead. You were going to jump in.
I would just echo Dan and Ellena and really emphasize on diverse data and really data literacy. I think focusing on that, and even just as critical, encouraging diverse students to really get interested in computer science and in the curriculum itself, and whether it's through community engagement, or through programs like Code Savvy, Technovation, Minnesota Aspirations, Computer Aspirations and Computer, and others, tap those diverse network of students and really get them involved, because equally as important as diverse data sets is that those participating in engineering and building these technologies have diverse perspectives as well.
Yeah, great point. Really, really essential. Thanks so much for sharing that. Eri, as you were mentioning kind of about the that last piece about diverse data sets, and not only that, but the folks who are interpreting the data or looking at the data also be representative of diverse backgrounds. It made me think of some courses that are in development in kind of the CS education, the computer science education space around data science and social justice. I know some former cohort members are working on some of those courses, and some folks in the education space. Joe Bowler is someone who's really big in kind of the math education space, has created data science course that really involves some important social justice work, and I think it's available freely online. So I want to be sure to point that out, as well as sharing that a lot of our cities, here's a link to open data from Minneapolis, a lot of our cities actually make data sets open and available. So thinking about, like, in our CS classes, could we offer up a lesson where we're looking at data on traffic stops, and thinking about, like, okay, let's do probability based on what the demographic populations of Minneapolis are. And okay, probability wise, does this actual data match up with kind of who we would expect to get stopped just based on the demographic data of Minneapolis? So that I think opens up a whole world of possibilities, and each of your perspectives are so valuable. Really, really appreciate you coming on today. I wanted to open it up now to any of our audience members who might have questions or have additional perspectives to share. I see Mark has added a comment here that says, very interested in learning how data science is connected to AI. Right now, data is viewed as being in competition to other real STEM math like calc, but now I'm getting how STEM is heading to a huge need for data science backgrounds. Yeah, so makes Joe Bowler, this math educator's debate with California traditional STEM folks make more sense. Yeah, interesting. Appreciate that. Any questions from our audience? I'll feel free to, you could unmute if you'd like to ask a question or share a remark for our panelists here, or drop it in the chat. And similarly, panelists, if you had other points that you wanted to share that we didn't get around to, feel free to jump in with those as well.
Hey, one idea I just want to throw out there is that there's a big movement in what we call the badging movement, where now every time we teach a class, we can offer these virtual badges, put the quizzes online and things like that. So if anybody has ideas on how we could do virtual badging for basic data literacy, I'd love to hear your ideas on that too.
Well, I'm definitely interested in that. So, and I'll connect with you, Dan, on the other point as well. Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things around data literacy, and this is not necessarily at the elementary school level, is there's always this danger of bringing multiple data sets together and making sure that that you consider privacy and so forth. So there might be fun data sets out there like DNR, camping, sites that I would encourage, if you want to just take something simple, look at what data is out there for DNR. If they're trying to do, where would, to your point, Andrea, where would they do either another campsite or a bike trail? But they have a lot of cool data sets out there. And the geospatial also has a lot of really good data, which is, of course, they've got tons of data that you could just kind of download and play with and get it in a visualization tool. I think having the visualization on top of it would be absolutely, to your point, a game changer, because it's hard to sift through the data. It's much easier to look at it visually in a dashboard or in a tool that is actually built to look for those outliers.
There's a startup called Future Model that's part of the beta cohort along with me. That's what they actually do, is they simplify that data visualization, and they draw they draw a direct line. They just kind of like a direct line to where the gap in data is. It's almost like that data matching to a sense, right? But yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that sounds really, really exciting. Like really something that would be so helpful for introducing some of this data with students. Lisa asked in the chat, do you have any favorite tools for data visualization?
I love the new Dash part of Plotly. So all of our curriculum now, we're trying to focus on Python, and Python has a wonderful set of visualization packages. Plotly is by far the most common way to do those things. And what's hard about this is it used to be that you had to be a programmer to create these visualizations. And now they have these new, what's called low code development things, where you actually don't have to write code to create these pie charts, bar charts, all those other things. You basically give it a data set and it's going to start to recommend those things, just like it was recommending drawing. So I definitely want people to look closely at the Python infrastructure. Remember, all of our AI Racing League is about Python, using it to change it, but we have these crazy data sets. We need to teach our students how to visualize good data and bad data. And so all of those are part of the Jupyter Notebook curriculum. I think that's a little bit for older students, but that's certainly what we are expecting all of our recent graduates to know the first day of their job. So we hope we can be consistent with those things.
One of the questions that came up in the chat is, do you have a favorite way that you like to define AI when you're either introducing it to someone who isn't very familiar with maybe the tech space or to kids? And then you have a good way to define good data versus bad data?
Well, for me, I'm not sure who that question was directed at. Anyone? Well, for me, I have my favorite way to describe AI is to take a lot of data and you're creating something to answer a series of questions and to look for hopefully anomalies, because I like to also, as part of AI, talk about the bias and what do those anomalies mean. The difference between good data and bad data, good data and bad data kind of goes to Erin's point, where you can see visually if you have data points that are in the majority and there's a gap or there's one outlier, is that because it's good data or because it's bad data? And so you have to kind of dig a little deeper to find out, oh, well, that's because they had this piece of data incorrect. So then what do you do about that? Because that can have an overall impact. I think about property values on a block, right? And if one is part of Section 8, how are you considering that in your AI data set? Because then the property value is very different. And so then the overall property value for that block gets dropped down, but you don't really know why. So was it because it was bad data, or because this is under a different category and that's not being accounted for in that particular data set? At least that's how I would answer that.
I see the other panelists nodding along. Thanks, Ellena. That's really helpful. Great. Well, I see a lot of good resources being shared in the chat here. This is awesome. Marie giving another shout out to the Teachable Machine, which is a tool from Google where you can actually show students how to do some of the training and create your own data set with visuals or sounds. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's the one I was referring to earlier, was that Google tool. So thank you for putting that in the chat.
Love it.
Yeah, just so you know, Teachable Machines is really an awesome site. Kids literally hold objects up to the camera to build a training set. And one of the simple things you can do to teach bias is only hold up red apples and get it to classify apples versus other things. And then hold it up a green apple and you'll see it will fail if you're comparing it with other things because it hasn't been trained on the right color of the fruit. So that's an easy way to demonstrate teaching bias. And I think that'll go down to the 5th grade level that kids could understand those concepts. So great tool to teach bias.
Love it. Well, I'm wanting to respect all of your time today and just want to say how much we have appreciated you all coming on to share about AI and bias with us and to share about your work and your passions. You are each remarkable individuals. We're so glad to have you kind of in our Code Savvy circle in different ways. And we would love the chance to keep in touch with you, to follow your work, and even to point students towards your work, and just knowing that we've got these really, really awesome and impressive folks right here in our local community who are doing really important work. If you have any social media or any ways that our educators and other folks on the call could follow your work, feel free to drop those in the chat. We'd love to be able to support you in any way. And just thanks again so much. It's been such a pleasure to have each of you on today. We really appreciate it.
Code Savvy Presents is produced by Code Savvy, a 501c3 nonprofit organization committed to making computer science accessible. Visit us at www.codesavvy.org.